All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're at. Hope you're doing great. What I'm about to give you here is something that you'll be allowed to use on your next test, and that is kind of a layout of everything that we've been talking about, a schematic, a map of what we've been kind of working through over the last week and a half to 2 weeks. And so hopefully this kind of brings some clarity as to how all these pieces fit together. So I'm going to get right after here, and if you have any questions, you can obviously ask me tomorrow. But I'm going to go ahead and put down here that the focus of the entire chapter was this right here. Okay, we've been working with quadrilaterals. Now, when we talk quadrilaterals, I'm going to put down here just a four-sided figure. Okay, just a four-sided figure there, and that's what we've been discussing over the course of this chapter 6. Now, those quadrilaterals were broken up into two different characteristics or traits. The one quadrilateral, excuse me, was either going to be a parallelogram or a non-parallelogram. Okay, and what I wrote on my paper, and I'm not going to write it on the board here because I'm afraid it's going to get a little too crowded, but I put down here that the non-parallelogram, and I'll just put a little arrow off to the side here, and I would write this down. I just put down that both pairs of opposite sides are not parallel, okay, just to kind of give a little general definition there. There could be one pair of opposite sides, but both pair of opposite sides are not parallel. So I just put down both pairs of opposite sides are not parallel. For the parallelogram, I went up and I bullet pointed all the different characteristics of the parallelogram. Okay. Now, one of the things I want you to understand about this schematic, this diagram of what the different types of quadrilaterals that we've studied is this, that, you know, a quadrilateral that is persisting with all of these different types, okay? All these different types have this trait with them because they're all underneath. It's kind of like the trickle-down effect. Well, the parallelogram over here, everything underneath here has that same trait. They have to be part of the parallelogram, which means that all of these characteristics that we're going to lift on the side over here, guess what? They belong to the rhombus, the rectangle, and the square. Okay, and that's what we're going to fill in here in a second. But I want to make sure that we understand that when we're talking about the square, even though all these traits are way up here, guess what? They're also way down here. Okay, we're just not going to rewrite them again because it makes it just too messy. Okay, so with the parallelogram, for the first bullet point here, I would write down both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. Okay, both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. I would write down for the second bullet point, and if this gets going too fast, feel free to pause. I would write down that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Now again, I probably should have written that first because that is our definition. That is the first and foremost thing. But on my paper, I put down that the second thing. Okay. The third characteristic of all parallelograms I put down was both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. Both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. And for the last one, I put that the diagonals bisect each other. Okay, the diagonals bisect each other. Now, after that, I moved down here to the rectangles. Okay. And for the rectangle, I had just two more characteristics that were added to, made it more specific than just a general parallelogram. Okay. So for a rectangle, I put down they have 4 right angles. Okay, that's our definition, right? 4 right angles. And I also put down that the diagonals are congruent. Diagonals are congruent. Now, if you want to add this other characteristic, I didn't put this down on my paper, but I'd be fine if you want to add this other characteristic. Remember, when the diagonals are congruent and they bisect each other because it's a parallelogram, they form isosceles triangles. So I don't know if you want to put that down. That's too confusing, but the diagonals do intersect to form isosceles triangles. Okay? If we move over to the rhombus, okay, the rhombus, by definition, has 4 congruent sides. 4 congruent sides. The second characteristic of the rhombus is that the diagonals are perpendicular. The diagonals are perpendicular. And then for the last characteristic of all rhombi, that's the plural of a rhombus, is that the diagonals bisect the angles. Okay, diagonals bisect the angles. Okay. Now, the last parallelogram that we looked at, actually we didn't talk much about it, is a square. Okay. But the thing is, there's nothing new about the square. The square has the same characteristics as the rhombus, the rectangle, and the parallelogram. Okay. So, are the diagonals perpendicular in a square? Yep. Are the diagonals congruent in a square? Yep. Do the diagonals bisect each other? Yep. Okay. So, all of those traits that are up above, they trickle down and they're part of the square. Okay. For the non-parallelograms that we've looked at in this chapter, there was the kite. Okay. And I have just one specific characteristic down here for the kite. Okay. And that's that the kite, the diagonals are perpendicular. In the kite, the diagonals are perpendicular. If we move over to the other categories, we have the trapezoid and the isosceles trapezoid. Okay. Now for the trapezoid, I just put down one little bullet point here, and that was this, that in the trapezoid we have exactly one pair of parallel sides. Trapezoid consists of exactly one pair of parallel sides. For the isosceles trapezoid, I wrote these underneath on my paper, but obviously I'm running out of room here. I'll just put bullet points like this. Okay, and it goes down there. Okay, but the isosceles trapezoid, I put down one of the characteristics is that the non-parallel sides are congruent. That's where we get the isosceles part. The non-parallel sides are congruent. The second characteristic, like the isosceles triangle, the base angles are congruent. Base angles are congruent. And lastly, just like the rectangle, the diagonals will also have to be congruent. Diagonals are congruent. Okay? So hopefully that brings some clarity as to what we're looking at in this this chapter here. Again, you can use this on your chapter test as an aid. Hopefully that'll help you be more successful. So if you have any questions, again, we can talk tomorrow. Good night.